Cool. So yeah, I'm in about the same boat as everyone else, right? I was hoping to prep some more stuff, ended up feeling not great over the break, and so I didn't get a lot more prepped or moving forward. But I figure with such a long gap between the last time that we worked on any of this and this time looking at the code, it might be a good idea to sort of go over the structure that we have so far again, how everything's put together, and answer any big questions about how some of these different pieces work if people have that up to this point. And then I figured we can continue working through sort of what we started at the end of the other class, which was we were doing this extra work of being able to adjust font size and stuff like that. And I figured we can finish implementing some of that so that that's a way to remind ourselves of how all these events and actions are hooked up right now to the application with the way that we have it working. I'm going to try and take this code off and see how I feel, but anyway, that's sort of where I'm at. I don't know what you guys think about that as our starting point, but everyone, the suggestion, I guess, will be that for the next class, try and have work through this implementing persistency over local storage chapter. So Cruz was already talking about this a little bit. The way this works, a short explanation of what local storage is and what we're doing with that is our current version of our application doesn't have any storage. So if you change anything, like we add another task or we add a new task, we have groceries or something, if we refresh it, everything disappears because it's not persisting that data anywhere. It's just recreating everything from scratch every time we start up the application. So this next chapter that we're going to work on will give us a place to persist. That's a term used in computer science a lot of times, or in programming, which means saving your data somewhere outside of just memory so that you can render that data again. And that could be where you persist data. It could be anything under the sun, right? You can persist to a file on a system. You can persist to a database. You can persist to some sort of cloud storage location. It can vary. In this case, what this chapter will have us implementing is persisting to something known as local storage inside of your browser. So a while back, browsers added the ability for individual web pages to have data saved for that web page in your browser. And that's known as the local storage standard. And that lets you, whenever you go back to that same page, so like whenever you go back to this same URL and page for your application, it will be able to read the local storage for that site and retrieve data out of it within that browser. Now, what that does mean, though, is that anything that's persistent will only be persistent in your browser. It's not something where you'll be able to go to another browser and get access to that data or log in somewhere else. That's because adding a whole login layer on top of this application would be a much more significant enhancement to put in. Authentication layers like that are complex. They've traditionally been a challenge, and so there's tons of implementations of them, although they've gotten a lot easier because there's a lot of libraries to help you build those nowadays than there used to be. But that's what you would need if you wanted to be able to persist it between different browsers or something like that, is some sort of authentication storing something where you can retrieve it no matter where you're at. Whereas local storage is a much simpler version of that and still gives you the persistence where stuff can stay around. So that's what we'll be tackling or going over in the next class, is using that local storage content. For this class, like I said, a lot of review. So if anybody has any specific questions on topics that they want to go over again, or stuff that we've covered up through the actions, the Flux actions chapter, implementing the note store and note actions, let me know. Otherwise, what I plan on doing is sort of stepping through the app again and using the font size setting as a review option. But if you have any specific questions, we can go over those first before we go through that example. Nothing? All right, cool. So let's review some of the structure of the application. Starting, again, when you're trying to learn how something's put together, a lot of times it's best to maybe start at some sort of index or high-level file. This is if you were pulling in somebody else's code and you're trying to figure out how it all goes together. Starting at the top works really effectively, in particular for React applications, because they're very structured in terms of just building on the way down. So if we look here, reviewing the different pieces we have at our top level, the top level thing that we're rendering is this provider component. And if we go and look at what our provider component is, it doesn't matter that much in terms of the details, but the provider, if you remember, is tied to Flux. This is tied to our alt Flux implementation. So what it's doing is hooking up our data so that we can provide that data and those Flux connections down through the rest of the application. So that's what this provider top level element is doing again. And then wrapped inside of that, we're rendering the app component. Now the app component is one that we're much more familiar with in a sense because we've done a lot more with. And let me step over to our app component. Our app component has a lot of our application logic in it. Really, almost all of the application logic exists in this component. And then when it renders, it's rendering a lot of the top level elements that we want to render. So it's rendering the area for the notes, as well as a button to add new notes. It's rendering all of the notes, but it's rendering a component notes that does the rendering for the notes. So it doesn't do the individual note rendering itself anymore. And that allows us to sort of encapsulate all that logic so we don't have to worry about it at this top level. We get to abstract it away. And then we've added in this stuff in the version I have right now, at least, which is just, let's play around with some font size settings. So this is what we're going to be implementing so that it actually changes something in our application going forward. And the part that's a little or newer, I guess, in terms of what we're doing with this application level is this connect option. So this is one of the newest things that we've implemented here, which was coming from, again, our Flux implementation, and connect is something that we wrote ourselves, I believe, as a quick thing for us to have implemented. And we didn't go to all the detail of how this connect worked because it's a pretty complex little component and you wouldn't typically write it yourself. But it's useful to know what connect is doing, right? So connect is taking, as its first argument, it takes a function which gets the different actual store data from your store. And so you can pull out the different pieces of store data that you want and assign those to different values for properties for this component. So what we're doing is we're pulling out from our store, our Flux stores, the notes and the settings. So if we go over and look at our stores, we can see that we've got a note store and a settings store that we've been creating. And these are setting some values. This is doing settings. The note store is doing this.notes. So these are all part of the store structure and our data. And then that's what we're pulling out here is what's coming from those. And then we're assigning them to notes and settings within this component. So those become properties that get passed into our app component. And here's an example of us pulling off the notes property and using it. And I mean, that's important because, you know, if we go up here, we see that we didn't pass in a notes property into our app component directly, right? So it's a little indirect in some respect in terms of how you connect this stuff up. It's not something where you can go look at where the component is invoked directly and see that it's being passed in. Instead, you have to look at how it's connected up to your store. So that's the first thing that we're hooking up for our app component is the notes and settings properties. The next thing that we've been hooking up in this connect is we're hooking up the actual actions so that this component, our app component, has the note actions of create, update, and delete, and the setting actions of update theme and update font size available to it. Now, these actions are bound to items in the store over here in each one of these store sections. So if we look here, what we see is this dot bind actions is binding our settings actions into this store. And that means that this store, this sub-store for settings, knows how to handle or is willing to process the update theme and update font size actions. And if we look, we've got update font size is one that we handle. So that's how we're getting hooked up here is, okay, we know we have the update font size action that we handle. Here's how we handle it. Here's what we do when that action is invoked. The same thing exists over here for the notes store, connecting the note actions. So this is all the note side of the application, where we're binding our actions, binding the note actions to this guy. And since those note actions are create, update, and delete, what we would expect is that we have create, update, and delete methods here that are bound to those actions and take some sort of action when that happens. And the action they're taking is updating our notes list in one way or another, whether it's updating an individual note, deleting the note, or creating a new one. Does this roughly make sense so far? How this stuff is sort of going together? So going back to our app, the last thing this connect function is doing, well, actually the connect function is done after that, right? So that's the end of the call to connect. But the interesting thing, if you remember, is what connect returns is another function. So all it's doing essentially is creating a component that's going to pass some stuff into something else. And what it needs is the component that it's going to pass stuff into. So if you will, this connect function is doing something very similar to, it's almost, I think I've sketched this out before, but it's almost creating a component like this. You can imagine that, let's assume we're hard coding this exact same connect function, that we're not dynamically getting notes and settings, but these things are all hard coded in some way. So this would be very similar to if we had a connect component. Oops. I'm writing this very badly. We had a connect component, and it got the store and the actions as its two parameters. And basically what it's going to do here is, and we know in this case that the store is actually, so let's just name these parameters that we're getting out of this. So this one would be notes and settings, right? So if we hard coded something like this, instead of having this sort of dynamic item that we have. And we also getting these notes actions and settings actions. The interesting thing here is it's doing a little extra logic against these to pull out the individual actions. So this second parameter ends up being like the equivalent of getting create, update, delete. Oh, it's going to have a problem with delete right there, isn't it? We really shouldn't have used delete as a name for this stuff, but I'm not going to pass delete in there just to save me the effort of fixing that problem. Update font size, for example. So this is the equivalent of these being passed directly in to this connect. And then what this connect is doing is it then also expects, but it does it as another step here. It expects the components that we want to wrap. So imagine, okay, now we're passing also a component in. And basically what this guy's going to do is return the component, render this component that we passed in. It needs to wrap it because, oh no, it can just return the component that we have. And it's going to add to that component all of these different properties. So that component now has a notes property, which is notes, a settings property, which is settings, and a create property, which is create, and an update property, which is update, etc. So basically, that's what connect ends up doing in the end is it takes all of these items that you're telling it to add in, the stores and the methods that you can make against those stores. Then you make another call from what it gets back, giving it a component, and it wraps, or it takes that component and renders it again with all of these different properties added into it. So that's what's going on through this connect bit here in sort of layman's terms. There's more complexity to it, but that's the easiest way to understand it. So at this point, we've got our actions hooked up, right? We were able to add new tasks, delete tasks, and we've even hooked up this change font size partially, where it wasn't that hard compared to what we already had for the note actions, because we just had update font size. And then for our, I'm going to go ahead and close these note action bits to give us more space here. And then in our settings store, we just, this dot settings dot font size equals our new font size. Our app here knows it's got an increase and decrease font size method on it, which calls the settings actions update font size, or settings actions update font size with a smaller font size. And then right here, we're just rendering the current value from our settings because this component gets re-rendered whenever those stores change. So the next item, let's just keep building off of this as sort of a refresher now. Let's say we actually want that font size, this font size, to change the font size that we're rendering our application in. The default font size for everything in this sort of app. Does anyone have any ideas of how we might accomplish that? And this might be an area where you may not fully understand how CSS works for some of this as well, and so that'll be a great overview.
Can't you set font size on the body of the, or some container element, and should pass it down to its children so everything changes?
Ah, see, so what he's saying is if you set a font size on a higher level element. So if you're in a tree of elements, like let's actually go over here and look at what we have. So let's test it over here and see if this works. If you set a font size on a higher level item like this body, then everything underneath it should inherit that font size unless it overrides it directly. So let's try it. Let's try setting the font size to 20 on this. Oh yeah, thank you. I'm used to writing it in React where it's going to put the pixels in there directly. Oh, it looks like it changed everything, right? And we can test that out. So it looks like it's inheriting the font size on everything underneath it, which is awesome. So if that works here, how can we take that same logic and bring it over into this application to try and set our font size?
The update font size method, or
So do you mean in one of these or in over here in the store where we update our setting?
not in the store.
All right.
I don't remember the terminology, but here you do it where you're doing this, and you do it inside the,
You mean like right here?
yeah, just like you would.
So does anyone remember how to apply inline styling? Style. That's how you do it. And then in React, you need one set of curly braces to tell it this is JavaScript. And then we're going to need another set to tell it this is a JavaScript object, because that's telling it it's an object. And then since this is React instead of the CSS that we had over there, we want to set font size this way. So let's test it out with just a static one real fast, see if this will work. Just give it a larger font size. It looks like it's definitely larger than it was. So now instead of static, let's just read our font size value. And how do we get that?
This cross settings.
That font size. All right. Let's give that a go. Sweet. That's cool. You got that working? So let's extend this now. This one's going to be a little trickier, and we're not doing anything with it yet. Let's add in. We had two things in this settings actions. We also have an update theme. So let's try and figure out together how we're going to support this update theme capability. Because right now we sort of have theme. I'm going to say let's start with the light theme. But we're not currently, I don't think, doing anything with this. So we don't even have an actual action that takes place, or we don't respond to this action in our store. And we're definitely not using it anywhere in the UI. So where do you guys want to start if we want to add in support for updating a theme? And we don't have anywhere in the UI to change the theme. So where should we start? And there's not a right or wrong answer to this.
We don't have a way to
you want to start with the UI? Let's add something.
What exactly do you want to do?
I don't know. What do we want to do for a theme?
Oh,
Do you want to limit them to one or the other, or do you want them to be able to use all of them? Do you have like dark option, or?
I don't know. What do we want to do?
start off with 2.
Let's start off with 2. All right. So let's step back over here and let's add another button here. That makes sense. A button that will, I don't know, maybe it's not going to do anything right now. We'll figure that out. But just let's go with that. See what happens. All right, so we got some sort of button here. I just put a placeholder in there because I didn't want to solve that problem. You know, even though it's a, like to me, very simple problem, sometimes you're like, oh, I just want to make sure the button's working first. Let's get that in there. So now, all right, we want this, I don't know what our next step we want to do is. We could potentially have this say switch to a theme, or we could have 2 buttons. We could say switch to light theme, switch to dark theme, and have them, both of them in there if we want to have a light and a dark theme. We could have this button change based off whatever the current theme is to the other one or something.
Is there a way to write it to where if you're on light, it says switch to dark, and if you go to dark, it says switch to light?
Sure. Yeah. So let's, all right. We already know how to get font size out of our settings props. And we know that the other item in here is the theme. So how could we get the theme, the current theme value out of that?
Too much making a component.
What?
Would it be too much to make a component?
Ooh, we could make a component out of this, sure. We can do that
So it will
too.
not have too much logic in the app
Yeah,
file.
we can easily do that. So you're saying, let's go ahead and make this a whole separate component even. All right. No, I don't want to delete the folder. Let's make a theme button component out of this guy. All right. So we know how to do components of different types. Let's do it in a very simple, remember there's basically two different ways to write components. You can do a functional component where it's just a direct function name, or you can do it as a class. And the functional component, I usually start as a functional component when I'm creating something new. The reason I do that is because I feel like it forces you to think about it when you want to change over to a class, when you need some of the class-based function. And so it forces a thought about that. So this is our theme component, and it's going to get props. I don't know what we're going to do with that yet. But right now, let's just take what we had over here for this button. I'm just going to cut this right out, move it into this theme button portion here. So I'm exporting this very simple sort of function right now. So let me try and see if I can get this working. I'm going to put it up here with my other component that I'm importing. So remember, I need to import it so that I can use it. And then how can I add a theme button component here?
Do I just need to do the other one?
Just like this. And since this doesn't take any, like it doesn't have anything that we're passing into it right now, we'll have it self-close. Let's see if this worked. All right, let me refresh to make sure that we've got the actual app running. Looks like it worked. So it looks like we've moved it over into a component, which is nice. You notice what we did there is now that sort of kept this complexity of this app simpler. And you'll see that as we add complexity to this theme button, why that can keep this thing simpler. But we still haven't solved the problem of showing the right label. Do we want to show the right label first? Or do we want it to take an action first? I don't know what we want to do. We can do whatever we want as our next step here.
I think doing actions and making it work and then making the button user friendly.
So you think having it take some sort of action first is what we want to do? All right. So we want this to do something when it gets clicked, just like any of our other buttons that we have. But what do we want to do when it gets clicked? And change the theme. So at this point, I'm going to change the way I've written this component a little because this thing's going to get more complex now, and we're going to need to render this or return the return is going to end up needing to be something separate because we're going to need some extra logic inside of this functional component around it. And some of that includes, we're definitely going to need to pass some properties into this, most likely, right? So what type of properties do we think this theme button needs in order to be able to perform its actions? And at this point, I'm going to make an assumption to try and simplify this a little bit. Let's say that the app itself is still what's going to be connected to the store. So it's the one that's going to invoke an action just like this. So eventually we're going to add a method here to change our theme at this level. So that's not going to exist inside of our theme button. That way this app is still the only thing really connected up. So with that assumption and the assumption that the theme button in the same sense isn't even going to be hooked up to the store to read the values out, it's going to have to get the stuff passed in from the app. What type of information do we need to pass into our theme button to have it work? Well, let's try this. Let's make it a little easier first, right? Let's go with the easier first. Instead of having it switch right away, let's just have the text of this say, or now let's do this. Hold on. Let's make our component a little more complex. We're going to put it in a div. And we're going to add a span here that says what our current theme is. And then we'll have our button that will tell us we can switch to the other theme. Oh, thank you. And now it's upset for some reason. No, because this is all JSX. I don't know.
I think it's because onClick is
Oh yeah, because onClick doesn't have anything in it. We'll add that in a moment. I think you're right. All right, so this should now tell us This works as expected. The current theme is something we don't know, and then switch to some other theme, right?
First, you have to pass the theme to properties. You can app.jsx.
All right. So we want to pass the theme in as one of our properties. We could even call it current theme if we want, but it doesn't really matter, I don't think. And what are we passing in as the theme? Because we've got our settings store here, which has a theme and a font size. I've already got examples of reading or getting the font size out of that. So how can we pass in the theme? It's just
This process.
theme. All right, so if we're passing that in, how are we going to use that in here now?
This process.
This dot props dot theme. Makes sense because we pass it in as one of the props. Oh, actually, it's not quite right because this is a functional component. And so functional components don't have this. It's just props.theme because props is literally a parameter. Whereas if it was a class component, then it is this dot props because it's a property of it. That's one of the differences between the two. Cool. So we've got that here. That's working right now. All right. Now let's say the next thing we want to do, I don't know, we want to have this button say switch to, our other theme. So now we're going to need some extra logic of some kind. And this can be, I don't care how we write this up. Somebody can help us figure out how to do this. If props.theme, let's create a variable to hold this first, right? So let's just create something here. If props.theme, so what do we want to check against?
So if you started out as light, you say that, and then
So we want other theme to be dark. All right. We could do else. Other theme is light, right? This wouldn't probably be the ideal implementation of this, but it works just fine. Perfectly fine way to implement this. All right, so now how are we going to get that into our button?
when you do the same thing as prop theme, you would just do the curly braces.
And curly braces and then just other theme. Do you get why we're using curly braces there? So what's going on is this is all JSX, but by putting the curly braces, you're saying, wait, here's a tiny bit of JavaScript in the middle. And all we're doing with that JavaScript is just getting the variable. Read the variable and put it here in the middle of this. So that's why the curly braces are being used. Awesome. So now we've got it's telling us what our current theme is. And it's telling us we can switch. So what do we want to do next?
This is where we go to that and turn on the method.
So we want to have something that'll change us back and forth? All right. So how do we want to do that? So this guy's going to need to do something on click, right? What do we want this to do when it gets clicked?
You want it to change to the other thing.
Wanted to tell app to change to
I like that explanation. We want it to tell app to change to the other theme, right? We do want it to change to the other theme.
Yeah.
But this guy, we're trying to keep the
You want
store
the
logic
method
out.
and the app instead of here.
Right.
Okay.
So what we want to do is do as little here as, or the right bit of action here and the right bit of action at the app layer. So what does this guy know about that might be the right type of action for him to do when you click the button? There's not right or wrong answers to a lot of this. You build these out a lot of different ways. So. Maybe let's step back over into the app for a minute. And let's look at how we wrote out some of these. So let's create another method here. We'll call it change theme. And it's going to be a lot like these other guys that we've had, right? So what do we want to change theme to do?
Basically the same thing, this dot props theme,
We've got the settings actions dot
and then update theme.
update theme. And the interesting thing is we haven't yet written that over here, so we're going to have to implement some sort of update theme. So let's just stub it out real fast here, even if it doesn't do anything right now. So we just have a function, so it's all happy.
You want to do a console.log?
Sure. Console.log.
And then do the same thing as this dot settings theme.
And that'll tell us something we're missing here, right? What are we missing?
Do you want to do equals other theme?
If this is a self-contained function, what are we missing?
Oh, you're missing the parameters and update theme.
So now what we're learning, just by building this out naturally, right? We're going, oh, wait a minute. This function needs a parameter passed in so that I can know what type of theme I want to set it to, right? All right. So we can call that whatever we want. Let's call it the theme, right? So now we've built a tiny little function, and what we know is, oh, our update theme is going to need a theme passed in. And that's what we're going to set. All right. Cool. That was really easy for us to build out, right? That guy was simple. So now here, we're calling update theme, which means we need to pass in a parameter, right? Or pass in an argument. So where's that argument going to come from that we want to pass in?
When it comes from your theme button.
Okay, yeah. So now what we're saying is change theme probably takes an argument, right? It takes a theme argument and it just passes it right down through here. That makes sense. And that gets us to, so if we've got change theme, now we have to get this change theme passed into our theme button somehow. So we could just call it change theme as a property on our theme button and pass in this dot change theme. That's fine. Oh, hold on. I may need to. No, I think I'll be fine. All right. So pass in this dot change theme, right? So we're passing in this local method as the change theme property to our theme button. And now the last bit that we have to do is hook that up in some way here for our on click, right? We could try that. Oh wait, props.change theme. See what happens when we do that. Let's go over here and look at the console. See what's going on. All right, we got some sort of problem somewhere. Converting. Yeah, we're not passing it into this change theme, right? So what we actually need to do here is we can't just say that when you click, invoke this method directly. we need to wrap this with another method or another function that tells it what theme to use, right? And we could do that inline. I'm going to write it up here just because I like keeping stuff cleaner myself. So we can say const, we can even just call this onClick equals, and this is just a function. And literally all this function is going to do when it runs is call props.changeTheme, passing in the other theme, right? So all we've done here is create a function that calls this when it gets clicked, but that allows us to pass in a parameter to it.
Okay.
And now here we'll assign it.
Okay.
And so on click, this guy's going to get called. When this guy gets called, he actually invokes this function here, passing in our other theme, which is this guy here, and so on, and goes down through to the store. So let's see if it works. I don't know. May have something wrong still.
It should, because we don't actually have dark stored anywhere for that to go back and forth, right? Or, no, we didn't.
We do. We have it stored. Yep. The only place that really knows that these two themes exist right now is this theme button.
Okay.
This is the only thing that knows what themes are valid, right? Well, that's not quite true because our settings stores our settings stores starting with one of these preset. But other than that, the theme button is the only thing that knows what themes are valid themes to have set.
You said that's probably not the ideal way to do it. You store both in settings and then have like a board statement where it goes.
At this point, it probably wouldn't be a big concern. The reason I just said it may not be the most ideal is because you might want this theme button to be generic and not know about that. So you may create a whole separate object to manage themes, and this guy gets that object, and the store gets that object. And that way, instead of multiple places knowing about what themes are valid, one thing sort of encapsulates the logic and says, oh, I know everything about what themes are valid. And anything that needs to know that can just ask me, and I'll tell them. And that way, if, say, we add in a couple other themes, we don't have to touch 4 places in the code. You ideally have to touch one thing in the code in order to add extra themes, right? But right now, we're not going to add a whole bunch of other ones. And when you're doing something at first, you don't want to think about the ideal way of writing the code. You want to try and get something working. And then afterwards, you go, oh, okay, now I've got it working. I'll take a moment, look over my code, and say, what can I do to make it better? Because otherwise, you're never going to get code written. If all you're ever trying to do is think, how can I write this the best way possible? You're never going to get code written. It's best to just hack it out and then go, okay, now let me rethink how to make this work correctly.
If you go back to the demo, the actual app,
Yes.
does it change the current theme? I know it's changing. Yeah, okay.
Yep.
I saw the button, but I didn't see it.
So we're almost done.
And now it just actually needs to do like what it did when we actually pass in the change.
So now we just want to do something off of our theme, right? I don't know what we want to do. That's a good question. How do we want our theme to change our application?
So, just so I know, the theme is the background color.
I don't know. What do we want our theming to be? This is up to us. We can make it background color and font color. I mean, that could be a legitimate thing for us to change. So, and here we might be able to implement this in different ways too. So we may not have to, like maybe what we do here is we go over into our CSS and we're applying some styling to the body right now, which is giving us our background color. I don't think we have easy access to the body element, unfortunately. So it's not going to be as easy for us to completely change all of this as I would like. Yeah, maybe it will be. Let's try something here. So let's give this guy a class. Oh, class name. Took me a minute to think, like, what do I need to call this? I couldn't remember. So let's just give it a class name right off the bat, and let's call it not body, because that was applying to the body element. So let's just call this app, for example. And then I'm going to go over here in this main.css, and I'm going to add some styling to app, .app class. So .app is how you refer to a class, is with the dot, right? If you don't have a dot, it's referring to an HTML element. So that's applying directly to the body. And what I'm doing here, this is a way for me to sort of override that body mattering at all. So I'm going to say that this app, his height is 100%. His width is 100%, which means this should be as large as, take up as much space as possible. And to sort of test that that's happening, I'm going to do a different background color on it. Let's just say blue. Oops, you don't use quotes. I don't use quotes on these either. So hard to switch between CSS and React syntax sometimes. So let's see what happens here. Oh, it still didn't take up the whole space. It's still limited, unfortunately. Let's see if I can make it take up everything. I don't know. Told you your size and width should be 100%. So why are you not? Oh, hold on. This guy is okay. It's because this div is internal to it. All right, I'm going to do one other style change too. There's also an app ID that is being added by the wrapper HTML that this demo application or that this Kanban app gives us. So instead of going through and trying to fix that and change the way that they're applying that, I'm going to cheat a little bit here and just give this a height of 100% and a width of 100% as well. So I'll show you that real fast if you didn't catch what I'm talking about. This is being added by the application, and it has an ID of app, but this is our React element with a class of app. And so I'm just going to apply some styling directly to this whole app guy here to say that should be 100% and 100%. And by doing that, come on, why are you still not working? That should be take up all of my page. Oh, my body isn't taking up everything? Okay, I'll apply that same thing up here. Is that gonna work? Might not still. I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing wrong with my CSS right now. This is why I hate CSS. Sometimes.
What if you did 100 instead of percent, use like U width and U height?
Maybe. All right, let me try setting the HTML element as well. Let's try that. There we go. All right. So ignoring that margin, which I can get rid of very easily here. Now we're getting this background color, right? Something that we control. So that was just me tinkering with some stuff to get us to the point where we can control this style. So if we want to, we could do the light and dark themes at this level instead of doing it inline styling. Like we could do a app light, for example, as a class. And maybe here we set our background color. What do we want the background color to be for a light theme?
White.
We can do white.
You can do it on side or on color black.
Is it? Oh no, it's just color. I believe it's the setting for. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to get rid of this since we're not going to want that to apply anymore. So if we've got a different class here now, and we want this class to apply if we are light, then what we're going to want here is a little bit of extra logic to change our class name. So our class name won't just be app, it's going to be a little bit of JavaScript here.
You do another side.
Well, I won't need to because this won't be a JavaScript object. I'm still just doing a string, but I'm doing some JavaScript logic. So what I want is app. That's getting the default app styling class, but I also want to have the class name of either light or dark, right? And we can do that by pulling our variable name and just appending it to another class name. So using this inline function, this.props.settings.theme. And this is probably not the best. Again, this isn't necessarily the best way to couple this because you're tied to the string name stuff very loosely here or whatever. And so now your CSS is tied to those string names. So if you changed your theme names, you'd have to change it there. But let's see what happens here. Looks to me like we applied the light theme. So let's create a CSS for the dark theme. .app-dark. And what do we want for this? Our background color?
Like reverse do black and then on color white. Well, you can't do white because it'll be white inside the box, right?
We'll have to see. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, because then you can't see your
Right? Because one thing we didn't change was we didn't change our
background.
input boxes. You can change the style of your input boxes and your buttons and everything if we want to. It's just going to require a little bit more work for us to do that.
So then instead of white, we got a light blue or light green or. Hold on, let's show me one.
Yeah, it works. We can go with green. We can go old school. Like,
Got a version of gray.
let's go old school terminal style.
There we go.
Like you're on an old DOS prompt or something. There you go. So now we've got the ability to theme our application. And we're doing this, applying this in a little bit different way than we were with the other stuff. Now, one of the problems with this, obviously, this theming isn't universal. We already ran across one of the issues, right? It's easy to apply these themes that cascade through everything, aka our background color and font color. But if we wanted to also theme the input boxes so that their colors changed and the buttons so that their colors changed, we would have to do a lot more work where this theme information is being passed through in multiple places, or the styling is maybe all of our styling is, instead of being directly applied with class names, we've created another function or another component that generates our class names for all of them. So then we could have like, then in our styling here, we could have like dot button or dot note dash light, dot note dash dark. And instead of directly applying that styling, for example, hold on, do we do it in notes? Instead of directly passing in that styling like we are here, we might invoke that function to get the theme based off the styling, where we would say, oh, this has a base class name of note, give us the rest of the class name based off our theme, and then assume that we've got CSS styling for that theming for each one of them. That might be one way we could do it if we wanted to make this more universal and sort of work across the board, right? But yeah, I mean, this is, I hope really, I mean, this actually felt a lot easier this time around than it has other times. And I think it's because we're starting to get all these pieces in place where it's a lot easier to add some of this functionality to our app now. It's no longer quite the burden that we had before of, oh, it's so difficult to add a piece of function or a piece of data, or how am I going to share this? Now we've got all this stuff split into these different areas. Oh, I want to add some more settings. I can set up some actions for them. I can actually do something with those actions. I can connect some component within my application so that it knows how to read the values and has access to those actions. And then I can invoke them in some way and then change styling off of them, right? So there's a lot of pieces that you have to touch to make that change. But the really nice part about this Flux architecture is that it's separated out each one of those. So when, for example, we were looking at this settings store, we didn't have to think about, wait, how is this theming applying in the application, and what are we doing with it, and how's it actually changing the styling? All we had to think was, we're just changing a theme value. I don't care what the rest of the application is doing with it. Something else worries about that. I only worry about being able to update a value, right? And then the app is like, oh, I only worry about being able to change the theme and apply it here. And our theme button, well, it's only worried about what the current theme is and calling this action with the other possible theme. So we've really broken down the logic into these much smaller pieces, which makes it a lot easier to work with than if it was all contained in one area. And you could go on and on with this, just add additional function, add other theming, add other characteristics. You know, all of that, very easy with this sort of architecture. So are there any questions on where we're at with that? Any questions on anything else up to the point that we're at in the book? No? All right. I think we're going to be done a little early today. I just wanted to take the time to make sure we reviewed, got all on the same page again, rather than diving right into the local storage. And then next class, so on Tuesday, we'll be talking about our local storage and how to actually persist this data in some way.
Yes. I've like typed 100 with 103 times.
He just totally called you out.
I actually don't know if I can. I think I have to have it multiple times.
Can't you be like HTML? I think I have class on Wednesday.
I mean, I could, yes, if I wanted to do that. If I wanted to, like, I could separate out some of this stuff. Like, I mean, this background color isn't being used anymore. So I could pull that out of here. And I could, another way to write this, for example, would have been to, let's assume that I don't want to apply the font family stuff on everything. I just want to get the height and width the same. So I could have written this like this instead. Let me finish cleaning the rest of it up. And then I don't need these because this is sort of sharing the rule up there. And then I don't need this defined here. Actually, hey, this is probably not on the HTML anymore. This goes back to just being the body element. And that should accomplish the same thing for us. because this is just a multi-selector. It's just a shorthand way of writing it out multiple times. And there's a whole, you could spend forever reading on the different approaches that people have for the way that you want to write your CSS to make it clean and easy to work with. CSS isn't particularly easy. You end up being repetitive at some level or other things. So there's a lot of different approaches people have for making it less repetitive or cleaner and easier to work with.
Like people's entire job is finding better ways of writing.
Some people, yeah. It's not my favorite thing. I mean, I've worked with CSS and it's cool and all, but it is one of those, I wish, the syntax is not my preferred way of working with it. So it's very, it's a challenge for me sometimes to figure out how stuff works. You saw that just now. Why isn't this height applying everywhere? Oh no, I need to go up to the HTML element. It's inherited from that level. So yeah. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the broadcast for anyone watching.